It was a week that saw Donald Trump become the first former American president to be convicted of a felony. We turn now to the analysis of Brooks and Capehart. That's New York Times columnist David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart, associate editor for the Washington Post. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, Jeff.
So I'd like to begin by asking you both to reflect on the significance of this moment. A former and potentially future president found guilty on all 34 counts in his criminal hush money trial, who, upon his sentencing on July 11th, will officially become a convicted felon under New York state law. Jonathan, you have the first word tonight.
Well, yesterday was a surprising day just because at one moment we're told the judge is going to let the jury go at 4:30, and then the next minute we have a verdict. Yesterday was a very solemn day. Whether you like the guy or not, the idea, the fact that a former president of the United States was found guilty on all counts unanimously by a jury of his peers, and that same person is the presumptive nominee for president of the Republican Party. It just for the office, it was solemn. I think for where we are as a country, it was a solemn day because in the before time, he would no longer be the candidate. That another more upright, more reflective of the party and the country would become the nominee. And I know he's perfectly reflective of the party as it is now, but I'm talking about the before time. And so, I was elated because he's being held accountable. But at the same time, I'm, a little crestfallen because of what it says about where the country is right now.
Somber and solemn. How does it strike you?
Yeah, I'll go back to Jonathan's phrase, the before times. In the before times, I was working in National Review, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, the Weekly Standard, a lot of conservative places. And there were certain pillars of conservatism. The first is moral character. That character is destiny, and if private virtue falls apart, the public order collapses. And we shouldn't forget the fact this case was about a former president paying hush money to a porn star. I mean, in what world might we enter that? The second is institutions and the power of institutions to safeguard society and hold off barbarism. And there was a moment that some of the people who were in the courtroom described when the jury asked the judge to read back some of the technical fineries of the indictment and of how they should think about the law. And apparently it was very dry and technocratic language. And yet the members of the jury looked at the judge with a rapt reverence. And I've always found in juries that juries take their responsibilities very seriously. And so this is character and institutions. And Donald Trump is, if nothing else, a transgressor. And if he wins in the fall, the attack on the institutions won't only be to the justice system, it'll be to the Defense Department, it'll be to the Attorney General's office. It will be a comprehensive assault on American institutions. And that's sort of what's at stake. Can those institutions hold? And in my view, yesterday they did.
Well, as Lisa Desjardins reported earlier in this broadcast, Donald Trump addressed reporters this morning. He spoke for more than 30 minutes, firing off grievances. He attacked the judge, the justice system, really tried to portray himself as a political martyr. This is a theme that's been central to his 2024 campaign. And Jonathan, it would appear that it's an effective way to rally his supporters because the Trump campaign says in less than 24 hours since that verdict came down, they raised $34.8 million. That's half the entire amount that they raised in all of April. How is this going to play, not just with his base, but with independent voters, with those soft Trump supporters who really potentially could decide this election?
I mean, they could, but this is one of those time will tell moments. I mean, we're just 24 hours from having this guilty verdict. So we don't know how independents are going to respond. We don't know how those folks on the periphery of the Republican Party who might not like him and what he stands for, but could potentially vote for him. But, bully for them, $34.8 million. Great. But what's he going to spend that money on? Who are these people he's getting this money from? But the other thing that is I find fascinating about this, and I forgot to mention this in my first answer, I can't believe Nixon President Nixon, Richard Nixon, had something that Donald Trump does not have, and that's a sense of shame. Richard Nixon had enough sense of shame that he resigned the office rather than be impeached, because the stain of it, he did not want the stain of impeachment. And yet Donald Trump has been impeached twice and is running for president again, basically to keep himself, he hopes, out of prison, given the other cases that are coming down the road.
Well, David, picking up on that point, what does all of this reveal about Donald Trump, the space he occupies in American life, and the degree to which he has really shifted the center of our politics?
Well, he tells a story. The story is they're out to get you, and the system is fundamentally broken. And that's a story a lot of people agree with, and a lot of people think was vindicated yesterday. I was very struck by my friends in the Republican Party, some of them Trump supporters, some of them more Nikki Haley types. I was struck by how vociferous their reaction was. A lot of them saw this as the equivalent of January 6th, that this was the day the justice system was perverted to launch a political attack, and the fundamental institutions of society are under threat. And so they are way more fired up than I anticipated. And these are people from Susan Collins, who's moderate Republican from Maine, over to the right. The second thing is the political effect of this is I suspect it'll be a little marginal. The people who are supporting him are going to support him. They've discounted who he is. And they buy the system is out to get you, and this revivifies for them. The people who are marginal, and there are a significant number of people who tell pollsters, I'll reconsider my vote if Donald Trump is convicted. But those are not people who pay a lot of attention to politics. They tend to be people who supported Biden in 2020 are now shifting over to Trump. So they're low information, fickle voters, and we don't know how they'll go. I suspect they won't go very far. I think the basic system of this story, the basic question of this election is the system is broken. We need this guy, no matter how big a jerk he is, we need him to take it to the man. And I suspect they'll stick around for him.
Well, after Donald Trump's appearance this morning, President Biden delivered remarks from the White House focused mostly on the Middle East. But he had this to say in response to what Donald Trump had said.
They found Donald Trump guilty on all 34 felony counts. Now he'll be given the opportunity, as he should, to appeal that decision just like everyone else has that opportunity. That's how the American system of justice works. And it's reckless, it's dangerous, it's irresponsible for anyone to say this was rigged just because they don't like the verdict.
Jonathan, I was talking to a Democratic operative today, not aligned with the Biden campaign, but who said this is the time that the Biden campaign should litigate the case against Donald Trump, to effectively say, you might have concerns about inflation, you might have concerns about Biden's age, but are you really going to vote for a convicted felon? Do you think that the campaign is doing enough?
Doing enough? The verdict has only been out for 24 hours, and I'm not yelling at you, Jeff. I'm yelling at that Democratic operative you talked to and the legions who this person represents, because this is the thing. This is what Democrats do. They remember State of the Union. Everyone was elated. Now we're back to, oh my God, what are they doing? It's been 24 hours. Give it some time. I thought the president's tone and what he had to say was perfect. Why? Because he was being the grown-up in the room and in the nation, defending the justice system and saying what is proper, right, and fair. There's plenty of time to litigate the case against Donald Trump. He's going to give tons of fodder to give the campaign an opportunity to respond. So Democrats, just calm down.
Well, our Laura Barone Lopez reported yesterday that the campaign in many ways echoes Donald Trump's judgment, and that the ultimate decision will be made by the voters in November, and that voters by and large will be voting on the issues, not necessarily on this case in particular. How do you see it?
I do think that. I like the fact that Biden sort of has been restrained, because this should not be Democrat versus Republican. This should be justice system versus Trump. That's what this day should be about. But Trump is not the only populist semi-authoritarian in the world. We've had 20 years of this now, and people all around the world have tried to figure out, how do we beat these guys? And if you look at the global consensus, if you get your mind outside of the American context, going low and calling them names, that just doesn't work. replicating his style, that just doesn't work. And if you look at the people who have successfully beat back populist strongmans in Poland and other places, they've gone substance. They've got, here are the issues, here's my program, here's that program, here's that program. I'm not fighting about his little gains. I'm just offering you a bunch of programs that are in your family's interests. And that way, that seems to be, to me, a smarter strategy to take on populists.
Let's talk more about how top Republicans are viewing all of this, because House Speaker Mike Johnson was on Fox yesterday and suggested that the U.S. Supreme Court should step in. Here's what he said.
I do believe the Supreme Court should step in. Obviously, this is totally unprecedented, and it's dangerous to our system. I mean, we've all discussed this before, and you all talk about it all the time. This is diminishing the American people's faith in our system of justice itself. And to maintain a republic, you have to have that. People have to believe that justice is fair, that there's equal justice under law. They don't see that right now. And I think that the justices on the court, I know many of them personally, I think they're deeply concerned about that as we are.
That was Johnson on Fox News this morning, in fact. And it's not just him. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who had a frosty relationship with Donald Trump, says, in his view, this case never should have been brought in the first place. How do you view the ways in which Republicans are circling the wagon here, even when it comes to this felony?
I find it reprehensible. And when it comes to Speaker Johnson, I just find what he says basically as dangerous as what Donald Trump said today during that press conference at Trump Tower. Speaker Johnson is a second in line to the presidency. He should be, if not, silent on this, as responsible and measured while disagreeing as the president was today, President Biden was today, in talking about the case. If anything gives me pause, it is the vociferous reaction of Republicans, particularly of Republicans who, in the before times, would be saying the exact opposite of what they're saying now.
David, finally?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's crazy. Listen, I had some doubts about an elected Democrat prosecutor going after Donald Trump in New York. Of course, anybody has doubts. But you've got to take the jury system seriously. And whether you like what Alvin Bragg did or not, Trump was convicted on 34 counts by a jury. The jury is the core of our legal system. And for Johnson to sort of wave the jury aside and say, I know better than the people who actually sat in the room and listened to the charges, that sounds like politics to me.
David Brooks and Jonathan Capehart. Thank you both.
Thanks, John.
Tonight on PBS News Weekend, against the backdrop of increasing gang and cartel violence, what's at stake in Mexico's largest election ever? Then how people with disabilities are navigating relaxed COVID precautions.
For many of us, we don't have the luxury to think that COVID, as a public health situation, is past us. And so it's been very isolating seeing the national discourse turn in that way.
And what's keeping rents high, and what could be done to help those struggling to find affordable housing?
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm John Yang. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has thrown up a hurdle to President Biden's proposed path to ending the war in Gaza. Said there can be no permanent ceasefire until Hamas's military and governing capabilities are destroyed. In a statement, Netanyahu said the notion that Israel will agree to a permanent ceasefire before these conditions are fulfilled is a non-starter. On Friday, Mr. Biden said Israel's bombardment of Gaza has left Hamas no longer capable of another large-scale attack on Israel like October 7th, and that it is time for this war to end. Families of Israelis held hostage in Gaza called on both Israel and Hamas to take the deal. Hamas said it views the president's proposal positively, as do many war-weary Gaza residents.
This proposal came late, but better late than never. We hope from God, the American administration, and the European community in general to continue to put pressure on Israel for a ceasefire.
Netanyahu also accepted an invitation from the bipartisan congressional leadership to address a joint meeting of the House and Senate. A barrage of 100 Russian missiles and drones targeted the power grid across Ukraine today. At least 19 people were injured, 8 of them children. The attack came as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is attending a defense summit in Singapore. He's trying to convince more Asian and Western countries to supply weapons to his country and cut ties with Moscow. South Africa's ANC party has lost its majority in parliament for the first time since the end of white minority rule 30 years ago. The party, once led by Nelson Mandela, got just over 40% of the vote in national elections this week. South Africa is struggling with high unemployment, electricity and water shortages, and rampant crime. And an attempt to launch Boeing's first astronaut flight was called off at the last minute today, the latest in years of technical problems and costly delays for the Starliner project. The astronauts were in the capsule on the launch pad and just minutes away from heading to the International Space Station when a computer detected a problem and shut down the countdown at 3 minutes and 50 seconds. It's one more bit of unwelcome news for Boeing, whose commercial airliners have been scrutinized for safety issues. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, what relaxed COVID guidelines mean for people with disabilities, and why rents are still higher in much of the country than before the pandemic.
This is PBS News Weekend from WETA Studios in Washington, home of the PBS NewsHour, weeknights on PBS.
Tomorrow, Mexico holds the largest election of its history, nearly 100 million registered voters. The legacy of outgoing President Manuel Lopez Obrador looms large over the balloting, which comes at a time of record levels of gang and cartel violence. Ali Rogan looks at what's at stake for Mexico and for the United States.
No matter the outcome in Mexico's election this Sunday, the country almost certainly will elect its first woman president, and voters are hopeful that will bring about change. This will be a great step forward because it shows us that we can all do it and that we all have the capacity to move forward, to take a country forward, as other women presidents have done. The leading candidates are Claudia Sheinbaum and Xochitl Galvez. Polls favor Sheinbaum of the ruling Morena party. She's a former Mexico City mayor and protege of the outgoing president Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Sheinbaum promised to continue the social welfare programs that made López Obrador wildly popular.
El modelo de la transformación.
This administration's promise to reshape the country is a humanist model, protector of patrimony, better wages, and pensions, without raising taxes.
Trailing her by double digits in the polls is Galvez, a former senator backed by an alliance of opposition parties. She promises a return to democratic checks and balances that she says have been eroded under the current president.
Como presidenta,
as president, I will punish the criminals. Extortion will end.
Galvez has been critical of López Obrador's failure to curb the cartel violence gripping the country, a key issue this election cycle. In the small town of Huitzilac, residents live in a state of constant fear, caught in the crossfire between warring gangs.
Suena mi teléfono? When the phone rings, I'm terrified that it could be the school saying something has happened to my kids.
The same fear haunts those seeking public office. Dozens of local candidates have been killed in the months leading up to the election. Whoever is elected, the new head of state will also inherit a nation grappling with an influx of migrants, shortages of energy and water, and the largest budget deficit since the 1980s.
Joining me to discuss this landmark election is Arturo Sarucán. He served as the Mexican ambassador to the United States from 2007 to 2013. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk about these two candidates. What are they campaigning on?
Well, the main issue for Mexican voters, the top of mind issue, is public security. Not only because 34 candidates for elected office have been killed, murdered by organized crime in this current cycle, but because homicide numbers during these 6 years of the López Obrador administration have skyrocketed. It's trending down, starting to trend down, but the numbers are still breaking records.
And as we mentioned, Shane Baum is leading in polls. She's a protege of López Obrador, also known as AMLO. What would her presidency look like, and what are the chances that she's going to win?
That's the big question mark. I think the main issue many Mexicans and international observers are asking is whether she will become her own woman, whether she will be able to wean herself from the shadow of López Obrador, from his ranch in southern Mexico once he leaves office. She has signaled that she might deviate in some aspects of what has been the López Obrador legacy, but I don't see significant changes in terms of her public policies going forward. If she's elected, she is the front runner, but a word of caution. I think polls are going to be what we're seeing in the polls of double-digit differences. I think it's going to be much tighter come tomorrow, Sunday. The results could be in the 5% difference, and that could trigger challenges both from the losing candidate, but also from López Obrador, because he might argue that the electoral institutions are shaving off votes from his candidate.
Fascinating. We mentioned that this campaign season has been exceptionally violent. How has that played into this election? How has it affected it, especially in those many local races that are taking place?
Well, we already saw a sign of organized crime muscling its way into local and state political processes in Mexico's 2021 midterm elections. And it happened again in two key gubernatorial races on the border with the United States, the state of Tamaulipas and the state of Guerrero, which is one of the most violent, racked states in Mexico. So the big question mark is, A, whether we will see signs of violence on Sunday, and two, the most important issue is whether organized crime will seek to whip or suppress the vote on behalf of Morena come Sunday.
You talked about national security being an important issue for voters. What are some of the other animating issues this cycle?
Obviously, the issue of access to public health. Because of the evisceration of the Mexican state by López Obrador, a lot of the public health programs have been whittled away. For example, access to cancer medicines for young kids. This has been a very pressing issue up and down Mexico. The issue of jobs in the economy is always a relevant one, particularly when López Obrador, which explains his popularity and the support for Morena, is responsible for having raised the minimum wage in Mexico. And so that's had an important impact in terms of economic perspectives for a very significant number of Mexicans.
Of course, this election comes just a few months before the one that's taking place here in this country. How will the outcome of these two elections affect U.S.-Mexican relations in the next few years?
Well, obviously, there's no country more important to the United States than Mexico, and vice versa. These two countries are joined at the hip for the good, I believe. But obviously, with the Republican Party, that today sees all the roads to the White House going through the border with Mexico, whether it's on immigration, whether it's on drugs, whether it's on the narrative of Mexico as the real national security threat to the United States. The double dynamic of what happens every 12 years when our two presidential cycles coincides is going to be challenging, particularly if Donald Trump were to return to the White House next year.
And how will the issue of immigration factor into that in particular?
Well, López Obrador has been weaponizing immigration in his relationship with the United States. You saw that in December when Secretaries Blinken and Mayorkas, in the middle of the holidays, had to run down to Mexico because Mexico decided to stop deportations, repatriations, particularly Venezuelans coming into Mexico. The Mexican government restarted those efforts. One of the reasons that explains why numbers now on the border have diminished in terms of undocumented immigrants being detained by the Border Patrol is what Mexico is doing. But in my view, there is a big question mark out there as to whether López Obrador, who will leave office on October the 1st, a full month ahead before Americans go to the polls, decides to open those migration valves to exert a bit of pressure on the United States and on President Biden before the election.
A fascinating dynamic to be watching for. Arturo Sarukhan, former ambassador to the United States, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
The pace of U.S. COVID-19 fatalities has slowed significantly. The nationwide death toll stands at more than 1 million people. With precautions like mandatory masking, social distancing, and isolation no longer in place, it can seem as if worries about the virus are gone as well. But for many people with disabilities, the threat is still very real. We asked people in the disability community to tell us about their concerns about this new normal.
Naomi Ben-Porat. I'm 26 years old. I live in Lowell, Massachusetts. I have POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. I would say that the changes in COVID policies have definitely made me a lot more nervous to be out and about.
My name is Ngozi Alston. I have scleroderma, which is an autoimmune condition. There's just so much erasure that exists, right? Like, we are not part of public spaces. We're not part of mass movement. We can't be. They're not safe.
My name is Jermaine Greaves. My different disabilities are cerebral palsy. That is a neurological condition that affects the brain and muscle.
Jones,
My
Muckback.
second disability is hidradenitis suppurativa. That is a chronic skin condition. I'm just afraid of getting sick and not being able to get through it. You know, that's a real concern for me.
My name is John Ross. I am a 71-year-old widower with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. I don't go to restaurants. I don't go into inside places.
My name is Julie Lam. I am immunocompromised. I have chronic kidney disease.
My name is Carrie Hudson. I live in Chicago, Illinois. I was born with spina bifida.
My name is Natalie Lampros. I am 28 years old. My current disabilities are I have a traumatic brain injury, asthma, and then endometriosis. There's still doctors that I have not seen in over a year because it would require me to take off my mask for the test.
The burden is constantly on me as the disabled person, having to ask and advocate for myself, even trying to hang out with friends, or people want to come see me, but aren't willing to take the level of precautions that I need them to.
A lot of grief, depression, and feeling very disconnected from our culture, essentially.
For many of us, we don't have the luxury to think that COVID, as a public health situation, is past us. And so it's been very isolating seeing the national discourse turn that way.
My social life has shrunk to zero. I cannot attend parties. I cannot hang out with friends like what I used to. It used to be we are in this together. Now, no, you do you. You're on your own. You look after yourself.
I'm thrilled that people are able to get back to their lives and do the things that we all love to do, but at the same time, we need to also recognize that life is precious, and we may not be out of the woods completely, even though it seems that way.
The person next to you, you don't know what chronic condition you have. You don't know what sickness they're carrying around. And you giving them COVID could be literally life or death. So I would implore people to think about community when they wear a mask, instead of thinking about themselves.
We should be doing everything we can societally, all of us, to take care of all of us, because there's really nothing that disabled people ask for as far as accommodation and help that doesn't also benefit non-disabled people ultimately. It makes a better world for everyone if we take care of everyone.
Bam, bam, bam.
When the Gallup poll recently asked Americans to name their top personal finance concerns this election year, the cost of housing was second behind only inflation. More people cited it than at any time since Gallup started asking the question in 2005. And little wonder, rents are well above what they were before the pandemic. Earlier, I spoke with Diane Yantel, CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and asked what's keeping rents high.
Well, so in some places, rents have cooled from those historic highs. They've leveled off or are even declining a bit in some communities, but the rents still remain well above those pre-pandemic levels. Over half of all renters pay more than a third of their income towards rent. So rental costs are still quite out of reach for the average renter, and especially for people with low or extremely low incomes.
You say that in some places rents are cooling off or dipping a little bit. Where is that, and what's going on in those areas?
It's primarily because either demand is down or supply is up, or in some cases both. So in some places there are some of the higher income renters who have been able to move into the homeownership market. So there's a little bit less pressure and demand on the rental market in that community. In other places, they're building more, and those new multifamily units are starting to come online. We are still well behind where we need to be in terms of building enough apartments to meet the demand in communities across the country. And that's why rents overall are stubbornly high. And it's important to note, even in those places where we are building more, the rents are coming down a little bit from those historic highs, but remain well out of reach for people with the lowest incomes. And for those lowest income people, just building more apartments won't make housing affordable to them. Landlords can't build and operate apartments that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes on their own, because the rent that those lowest income people can afford to pay doesn't cover the costs. So that's a basic market failure that requires a government intervention. And in this case, the form of the intervention needs to be subsidies, rental subsidies, to make those apartments affordable.
In a number of states and in Congress, there's a push to limit the corporate ownership of rental units. Would that have an effect, do you think?
The research and the evidence have been very clear that, by and large, corporate landlords are among the worst actors as landlords. Corporate landlords are more likely, according to the research, to be serial eviction filers as a profit-making tactic.